Now let's look at situation number 6 on page 70. This is the last problem, and we'll read it together again. It says Alpha owns 100%, and I'm going to assume that means a 100% mineral interest, and conveys a 3% royalty to Bravo, and then conveys 50% of the minerals to Charlie. And watch this language, subject to prior reservation. That's what's going to be in the conveyance instrument. Alpha and Charlie then lease to David and Echo, respectively. So let's diagram it out. We start off with A, who has a 100% mineral interest. And A then conveys a 3% royalty to B, or Bravo. And that means Bravo has now a 3% non-participating royalty interest, meaning he has no right to sign an oil and gas lease, but he is entitled to royalty payments. And A at this point is still retaining their 100% mineral interest. But then A conveys 50% of the minerals to Charlie. So that means A has 50%, and now Charlie has the other 50% of the minerals. But he also says subject to prior reservations. Very important. Then Alpha and Charlie lease to David and Echo, respectively. So we know that David and Echo, since they both took leases, now have a 100% working interest in the property, but Alpha still owns his 50% mineral interest because this is just a lease to David. This is just a lease to Echo. So the question then is, who bears this 3% overriding royalty interest? Or not overriding royalty, but this 3% royalty interest. And the answer is that because A conveyed it to B and then conveyed his interest to C, and he used this language, subject to prior reservations, that means that C took this 50% mineral interest subject to this prior reservation of the 3% non-participating royalty interest. So what's going to happen now is A and C are going to split the payment of the non-participating royalty interest. So A and C are going to split the non-participating royalty interest. And that means A would pay a 1.5% non-participating royalty interest, and B would pay the other 1.5% of the royalty interest, or the non-participating royalty interest. Okay, and the reason for that is because he took subject to prior reservations. Now, let's say in your materials it goes on to say, let's change Alpha's conveyance to Charlie. So A's conveyance to Charlie is a warranty deed now. A warranty deed guarantees that A will defend his title and guarantees that he's the owner of the property. But it does not mention prior reservations. The question again is, who bears the Bravo 3% non-participating royalty interest? Well, if he didn't convey to C subject to prior reservations, that means that A alone would bear the burden of the 3% non-participating royalty interest. It's not half anymore. Oh, let's see, who bears it? A bears it, the full 3%. Okay. Now your text says that it doesn't, that only A has to pay it because of the Duhigg rule. I don't know if y'all remember the Duhigg versus P.V. Moore case, which came up with the Duhigg rule. But what happened was A conveyed to B. A had 100% and conveyed to B 50%. So then B owned 50% and A owned 50%. Then B conveyed to C a 50% interest. So the question is, who owns what? Well, we know A owns the 50%. And you would think that B would own 25% and C would own 25%. But what the court said was because B only owned a 50% interest and he was conveying a 50% interest, you cannot convey what you do not own. And so therefore the interest of B was 0 because he owned 50% and he conveyed 50%, and C owned the other 50% working interest. So what it's saying is this is a very similar situation, because if you don't mention any prior reservations, the court is going to only look at the four corners of the document to determine what you meant by that. You own 50%, you're conveying 50%. And again, the key is if he had said 50% of my interest or 50% of my 50 interest, he would have been okay. But what he said was 50% interest. And that was where the problem is. So this is sort of like a Dewey type situation because it didn't mention the prior reservations, and therefore we're going to assume that A is responsible for the entire non-participating royalty interest.